Setzei, which contains many, many laws, very significant number of laws, some famous ones like Shiluach HaKan, sending away the mother bird, etc. I want to just concentrate on a small thing at the end, towards the end of the Parsha. The Torah says that if there's a dispute, ki hiyeh riv, if there's going to be a dispute bein anashim between people, v'nigshu el hamishpat, and they come to the judge, ushvatum, and the judge has to judge them. And then v'hitztigu es hatzadik v'yeshu es harasha, he says this one is the right, the one who's right is right, the one who's wrong is wrong. And then there's certain the consequences. It goes into what you give the consequences, in particular in the cases where someone gets lashes. Um, but the first wording tells you if there will be a dispute, then they're going to court. And Rashi comments on that. And Rashi's troubled seemingly by why the Torah has to say if there will be a dispute, they will come to court. Why don't you just say if two people come to court, and then here's what happens. Why do you have to introduce it by if there will be a dispute? So Rashi says, therefore, he's quoting us afraid that it's a sequence of events. If there's going to be a dispute, it's going to ultimately end up in court. They're going to end up in court. Now, why they're going to end up in court? So Rashi continues, he says that shalom, peace, does not come from disputes. When you have mariva, that's a higher level of dispute, it just doesn't work out. You don't end up having peace when people are fighting with each other. And he gives an example. He says we see from the story of Abraham and Lot that, if you remember, in the beginning, towards the beginning of the Torah, where they were relatives, and it was a dispute between their shepherds, and therefore they had to separate. And Lot had to go off to he decided to go someplace. He ends up in Sodom, and of course he ends up with all the bad guys, right? And that's where he ended up. So he says you see that good things don't come out of disputes, and peace does not come out of disputes. And the Gur Aryeh Maharal is wondering, like, what's the problem here? It's pretty good to go to court. If you go to court, what's going to happen? You'll resolve the dispute, right? The judge will judge, and he'll decide what should be, and that'll be the end of it. So what is the big problem here? And he says what it's telling us is that if a person is having a dispute, if they're maintaining a dispute, what's going to end up happening is you're not going to compromise, and that's why you're going to end up in court, because you're really the ideal for anytime we have a disagreement, the ideal is for us to figure out a way to work it out, right? We should compromise, even in court, right? They try to come up with a compromise usually in a case, but certainly before you get to court, why do we need to go to court? Let's see if we can work it out together. And if we're seriously intent on making things good, then we will work with the other person and try to make it better and try to work it out. And you should be open to compromise. He says the problem is that dispute is a little more than just I say that you owe me $100 and you say you don't. That's not necessarily a dispute. That's a difference in terms of we have a difference of what we think is correct. Dispute is when it starts getting a little more than that. It's getting personal, right? It's getting aggressive, and in a case like that, that's where you're not willing to compromise. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that Rav Huna, I think it is, says machlokes, dispute, is like when you have a river that overflows its banks a little bit, and then the water starts to flow. And once that water starts to flow over the sides, it goes out into the fields and into the streets and everywhere else, and you have a flood and you're stuck. It may have started out with a little crack in the levee or wherever it was, but once it gets past there, then the flood, you can't stop it. And the idea being is that once you have that crack in terms of having a dispute, it just becomes bigger and bigger, and you can't stop it from the beginning. And Rabbi Hartman is a commentary he brings on the Maharal. He quotes the Nesiv HaShalom, says, if you take the word shalom ends with a mem, right? And we know there are two types of mems. There's a mem sofit and a regular mem. So a mem sofit is basically like a square, kind of, and it's totally enclosed. There's no cracks, there's no breaks. So the word shalom is complete. And when you have something, there's no breach. There's no crack in the mem in the word shalom. On the other hand, the word machloket, which is the word for dispute, starts with a regular mem. And if you can picture in your mind what a mem looks like, a mem on the bottom left-hand corner is a small little crack. That's what a regular mem looks like. It's a small little break on the bottom left corner of a mem. And he says that's the beginning of a machloket. The beginning of a machloket is a small little argument, but then it grows. What's the next letter in machloket? Chet. If you picture a chet, that's a huge hole on the bottom. The entire bottom is missing, right? All of a sudden, from that little crack in the mem, you ended up with a whole total opening in the ches. And that's how machlokas works. You start with a little something, right? We're arguing over something, whatever it might be. And the next thing you know, we're not talking to each other. And 10 years later, we can't even remember why we were arguing in the first place, right? But that's how things go. And he says that that's the idea of that little bit. And here in the Torah, what's happening, he's telling you, is that if you start out where you have a little dispute, if you're not going to resolve it, you're going to end up having to go to court because you're not going to be willing to compromise. And if he gives another example to highlight the ideas, if you picture a shirt or any kind of a garment, and you try to pull it apart, try to rip it. It's very hard to rip a good garment. But if you just make a little teeny tear, just a tiny little tear at the edge, and then you try to pull it, you can rip apart the whole thing, right? So that's the idea in general is when we're dealing with other people is that we have different things that we disagree on, and we can disagree as long as we're understanding that what we're disagreeing on is a point of importance, and it's something that we each need to stay on focused as to what we are disagreeing about, and we're staying on focus as to the issues. That's what we're arguing about. We're arguing about whether this issue is right or wrong, etc. But once we start moving off to the side a little bit and we start getting into personal, we start getting into other things that are not the issue, all of a sudden you've created that crack. And then it was almost impossible to bring it back. And the dispute gets totally out of hand. And therefore, what we need to do is make sure that we keep our eye when we do have disagreements, which most likely is something which is pretty common. And we have disagreements in our studies, right? Also, it's the same thing where we have a difference of opinion as to what is this piece of Gemara saying? What is this commentary saying? As long as we're staying focused on what it means and what is right, that is going to be able to be resolved. Even if we can ultimately even agree to disagree, but we'll get along. Once we make it into something more than that, where it becomes personal, then it becomes into machlokas. It's spread out so big, you can never put it back together. And that's what the Torah is teaching us in this Parsha. Have a great Shabbos, everyone.